Shalom from Jerusalem. This is TV7's Israel at War update. And as we're set to deliberate the latest developments here in Israel, throughout the region and beyond, with chief focus, of course, on the 7 separate fronts which Israel is facing, including international events with direct or indirect implications to Israel, it's always important to remember how this war began. 384 days ago, on October 7th of last year, the Islamist Hamas and its terror affiliates in the Gaza Strip launched an onslaught on southern Israel, declaring war by perpetrating a massacre, murdering some 1,200 mostly Israeli civilians, wounding over 4,800 others, and kidnapping roughly 250 people, including elderly, men, women, children, and infants. 101 of them remain in Hamas captivity to date. The subsequent day, on October 8th of last year, Iran essentially joined the war when it green-lighted its Iranian proxy, Hezbollah, in Lebanon to launch cross-border attacks against Israel. Since then, over 12,000 rockets and missiles, unmanned aerial vehicles, and other projectiles were launched from Lebanese territory towards Israel, and not only by Hezbollah alone. Also, additional Iranian proxies from Yemen, from Iraq, and Syria have also launched cross-border attacks against Israel by various munitions, including Iran proper. Let's now turn to our TV7 editor-at-large, Mr. Amir Oren. Amir, it's good to see you. What can you tell us about the latest?
So very briefly, earlier today, Secretary of State Antony Blinken and the Qatari Prime Minister have announced in Doha that the negotiating teams of Israel, the United States, Qatar, and presumably Egypt will soon reconvene in Doha in order to resume the talks on a ceasefire and hostage release deal. This, of course, with less than 2 weeks for the American elections. Another news out of Washington, the Defense Intelligence Agency, DIA, has yesterday published an unclassified version of its report on what it calls the nuclear challenges posed by Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran. And in the Iranian section, it says with almost certainty that Iran has yet to decide on pursuing a nuclear weapon project, but that it is getting dangerously close to the point where once it does decide, it will be very easy for it to do it.
Indeed. Thank you, Mr. Oren. You're free to go, as we are, of course, in a high holiday here in Israel, and we will continue with our other panelists. 2 points that I will make, however. One, with regard to the DIA report, of course, it is valid. It's valid up until June, if I'm not mistaken, Mr. Oren. Therefore,
right,
there have been several.
Yeah.
Exactly. So June 1st, several months have progressed since, including an attack, of course, against Israel, something that needs to be taken into the equation. And with regard to Doha, I'd like to immediately turn to Washington, D.C., where we're joined by retired Colonel Joel Rayburn, formerly a senior director of the NSC for many of the countries in the region, as well as the U.S. Special Envoy for Syria, and also currently the founding director of the American Center for Levant Studies and a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute. It's good to see you, Joel. Again, going back to Doha, I'd like to ask you, particularly during a joint press conference, which Mr. Oren referred to, the foreign minister and prime minister of Qatar, namely Mohammed Abdulrahman Al-Thani, came out and said that the starting point of Hamas, its demands since Yahya Sinwar's demise, is basically nothing new. Specifically highlighting an Israeli withdrawal, a demand that Israel ends the war, pretty much giving Hamas victory at the expense of an Israeli defeat. This is obviously detached from reality. What are we to expect from the ongoing process? And are we in a situation where we can expect any good faith negotiations taking place in such a critical time right before the November elections in the U.S.?
of course, like so many other people, I really hope and pray that there can be some sort of agreement that would release the hostages, but also result in essentially the disarmament of the remnants of Hamas. I don't envy any negotiator who has to try to bring something like that about, very difficult prospect to begin with, in a time when there's an impending U.S. election and the current administration essentially will be viewed as having little leverage because it's not going to continue past January 20th, regardless of who wins the election. I think the only kind of leverage, or the best kind of leverage, I would say, not the only kind, the best kind of leverage that a negotiator would have in that position would be to say that whoever they're trying to negotiate with should make a deal now, because the prospects for a deal will get worse under their successors. So sort of a good cop, bad cop type of scenario. And a skilled negotiator would be using that. You have political pressure and political leverage, which is going to weigh on such a negotiation. The other aspect is the military pressure. So I think, honestly, in this kind of scenario where a U.S. administration is in a difficult end of administration period, it's the continued military pressure from the Israeli Defense Forces that is going to be the most decisive factor in Hamas's calculations, just sort of bring them to a point where they have to capitulate. That's what I would expect. I wouldn't expect, but I think the larger political considerations are very difficult in this time right before a U.S. election.
Indeed. Well, let's turn to Madrid, Spain, where we're joined by Dr. Rafael Barraji, formerly Spain's national security advisor, currently the CEO of Worldwide Strategy. It's good to see you, Rafael. I'd like to...
My pleasure.
The pleasure's all ours, as always. I'd like to immediately ask you about another note that was made by Secretary of State Antony Blinken when asked about whether an Israeli strike on Iran would bring about a regional escalation from the current state of hostilities, of course. What can you tell us about the calculus within that framework? And according to what Blinken stated, was that he was basically telling the Iranians, do not retaliate to Israel's retaliation, because the next time around, your strategic infrastructure will be targeted.
Yes, indeed. I think the logic from the American administration now is basically dependent on the electoral cycle and the elections in 2 weeks. No? And I think every step they are taking is trying to avoid from here to the election day any military action that may produce some reaction from Iran vis-a-vis their neighbors, Saudi Arabia or other countries in the Gulf, or against Israel. But having said that, every reaction from Iran is dependent on what kind of a strike, if any, Israel does finally, before the elections. So I think it's too much pressure, not on Iran, but on Israel, not to do anything that may hamper the momentum of the Vice President Kamala as the candidate. And that's a political reason, not a strategic reason.
Indeed. Thank you, Dr. Rafael. Also joining us from Central Israel, Brigadier General in Reserve Yaron Rosen, formerly the IDF Chief of Cyber Staff, a Israeli Air Force commander, as well as a fighter pilot. It's always a pleasure to have you, General. I'd like to ask you particularly about Israel's preparatory work. Obviously, there were a couple of leaks that some trader within the American system provided an Iranian Telegram channel with. Since then, of course, Israel continues to prepare, and we saw Defense Minister Yoav Gallant traveling to the Ramat David Air Force Base, where he held a extensive conversation and situational assessment with a number of pilots, during the course of which he also highlighted that everybody will understand the extent of preparations, the extent of Israel's or the Israeli Air Force's readiness following the attack on Iran.
Yeah, it's interesting to see how all this will play out. And again, I'm assuming it will play out before the elections. And I think, in the construct of, the overall boundaries of retaliation, given the sensitivity of the elections in the US and other sensitivities as well of escalating, how much you want to escalate with a country that is more than 1,000 miles away, border to border, but the assets that we're talking about may be more than that. I think that in preparing for this retaliation, I think that the best thing Israel can do is one of the two, or go for all out on the nuclear facilities. I'm assuming that will not be the case, or doing something that will provide a very clear message what the next step will be. So actually what it's supposed to do is sort of send a message of, okay, this is our retaliation. And if you continue, it's going to get really, really worse. Now, I'm not talking about what happened after the last retaliation. Israel retaliated after not the last one, the one before in April. I'm talking about something much, much wider. I would guess it would be on military assets that would allow Israel and her allies to attack the nuclear facilities or leave them without their air defense. So I am guessing that air defense, or in the language of the Air Force, air superiority, would be a very important target from the radars all the way to the surface-to-air missiles. And that also sends a message to Russia, to everyone that is helping Iran in preparation for this retaliation.
In reference to air superiority, obviously, we do have the Russians deploying the various electronic warfare, we'll define it as such, in Syria, in Iran, similar to the ones that they have in Syria, in order to try and protect some of their critical infrastructure, alongside with China, that just recently provided Iran with a new UAS or counter-UAS system against drones and other types of munitions. So there is a collaboration between Russia and China with Iran in defensive type of weaponry, something that Israel is taking heed of, and so does the United States and others. But right now, let's turn to Colonel Rayburn. I'd like to ask you particularly, the BRICS summit in Kazan, we're seeing Russian President Vladimir Putin inviting a long list of world leaders, to include, among others, of course, Xi Jinping and Narendra Modi, but also figures who have been classified as Western-oriented, such as Abdel Fattah al-Sisi or Hamad bin Zayed, or even the recipient of billions of US dollars and European dollars and others, namely Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas, the Western favorite for the leadership in the so-called Palestinian territories. What are we to make out of that, particularly taking into context the fact that he has announced his aspiration to have the Palestinian Authority join BRICS?
Listen, there already is a revanchist strategic alliance, if you will, among Xi Jinping's China, Vladimir Putin's Russia, and the Iranian regime. And then there are some other satellite states that have been participating in that, such as North Korea, Venezuela, and so on. That has already been arrayed against the United States, the West, and our allies and partners in many regions, including the Middle East. That's not new. So the BRICS Forum, I think, really is a place where other states sort of hedge their bets away from the U.S.-led West toward this revanchist alliance in a period of U.S. weakness, when some of our traditional allies and partners are looking and saying, well, can we be sure that the United States and the West and its allies and the people who have signed on with that side are going to win the 21st century? Or is there a prospect that the United States is weakening, the West is weakening and declining, and actually we need to make our way safe potentially if this other side wins? And this is something that's going to happen again in the face of U.S. weakness. And I think over the past 3.5 years, there has been a vacuum in U.S. leadership. There's been a perception that the United States is in decline, that it's weakening. I think this was accelerated with the collapse in Kabul, the disastrous withdrawal from Kabul, which I also think led directly to the Russian decision, Vladimir Putin's calculation to invade Ukraine and so on. Now, this doesn't mean that the die is cast. It doesn't mean that that side is going to win the 21st century. I don't think they are going to. I think they're actually quite relatively weak. I think that's been shown in the results, for example, of the invasion of Ukraine, and in the results of the Iranian decision to go to war on October 8th. It can't possibly be that the supreme leader in the IRGC on October 8th, when they made the decision to jump into the fray, we're looking ahead a little over and say, it's possible that a little over a year from now, we could be bracing for a strike from Israel that might be the end of us, and that Hezbollah would be bleeding out and that Hamas would be essentially militarily defunct. It's a miscalculation, and I think those who are going, it tempers, I think, the situation with the BRICS.
Dr. Bardahi, your take on this?
Well, let me remind the audience that among all the participants was somebody that you didn't mention, Jonathan, United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres,
Right.
which was a nasty surprise for many in Europe that are supporting Zelensky against the Russian invasion of Ukraine. But, living in the Middle East, that Antonio Gutierrez has always sided with the wrong guys, starting with Hamas, following Hezbollah, and everything related anti-Israel. So I wasn't so taken by surprise by his appearance there. But it's also a degree of the immoral level that the United Nations has achieved over the years.
Just for the context, for the sake of our viewers, Antonio Guterres's trip to Kazan for the BRICS conference, or leadership summit as they define it, came after he refused to go to the Ukrainian peace conference. So he clearly chose to go to the Russian invitation after rejecting the Ukrainian invitation. That was basically what brought about justified outrage by many in Western civilization. Go ahead, Doctor.
Yes. No, I was just saying that I entirely agree with Joel when he said that there is a nexus of or a kind of alliance or informal alliance of revanchist and rogue nations against the Western liberal order, no? Starting with Moscow, Beijing, North Korea, and Tehran, no? And other places like other countries. But again, that's not a surprise. I think that's a problem of their feeling the West weaknesses and vulnerabilities, and they are taking advantage. Politics is like nature, a Bohr's vacuum, and when somebody is leaving, somebody else is taking the place. And I think we have been for many years dreaming that the world was in our hands and the future was ours, and we were wrong, unfortunately.
Indeed. Well, General Rosen, one of the key absentees in that discussion was Israel, of course, which doesn't look to partake in BRICS for multiple reasons, but at the same time trying to relay to the Western world the strategic importance of the State of Israel, which naturally every practitioner and world leader understands, at least from a Western perspective, to the various complexities at hand within the context of strategic power competition. How can Israel double down on making clear that Israeli victory is a Western victory, and the fact that the West does not necessarily stand by Israel as a whole is, as Dr. Rafael Bardahi just mentioned, an indication of the corrupt or the moral corruption within many of the Western institutions?
Yeah, the BRICS summit is definitely it's a parallel universe almost. You see who's there, and you immediately you look at it, and from a moral standpoint, it's just quite amazing to see how this alternative world order is talking to each other. And when you boil it down to Russia and Iran as the center from, you know, the West perspective, it's just appalling how these two terror states and terror leaderships are gaining power. But I believe that Israel, in the state that we are right now, and the changes that have occurred in the last month or so, I think we have a chance if Israel succeeds in gaining its support, the support it needs to continue the barrage on Hezbollah and on Iran through the retaliation and whatever comes after it. It's something that has to continue. The pressure on these terror militaries and terror nations has to continue in order for us to really change and produce some kind of new hope for this region. I think that what we've seen in the last month or so is a real chance to change the narrative that we were sort of caught in the region. And now is the time for Israel to work much, much harder than it has before on the diplomatic side to really work with its ally, namely the United States. Right after the elections, it will be much clearer where this is headed. And hopefully, with a different administration, I mean, from my side, that's what I see. I think it would be much more constructive to change the narrative of this region, which has been sort of a facade for over a decade, almost 15, 20 years. We've been telling ourselves stories that it's all okay, that there's this huge terror state and terror military in the Middle East. And we can see now what that means, and the whole West can see what it means. And it is now time to double down and change it, both militarily and diplomatically.
A minute and 10 seconds for each. What should we focus on for the next 24 hours, for the next 72 hours for that matter? Colonel Rayburn, we'll start with you.
I think what's happened with essentially the military defeat of Hezbollah and Hamas, and what may be the impending restoration of deterrence by Israel against the Iranian regime, this is going to have profound political implications. It's going to lead to a recalibration politically, geopolitically across the Middle East and beyond. And I think statesmen, diplomats, so national security strategists need to be planning how to take best advantage of that, to try to have some political initiatives that can lock in those consolidate those military gains into political gains in a way that we, for example, in the United States, have not been good at doing in the post 9/11 period. Now's the time, I think, to try to get things on a more stable footing.
Dr. Barrahi?
Well, I think in the next days, the pressure will be on Israel to reach a deal with Hamas on Gaza and the hostage release. But I think Israel has all the cards in their hands now to avoid any back idea or any bad idea that may come from any corner of the wall, including the White House. I think the defeat militarily and politically of Hamas is still relevant and still pending. Hamas still has some strongholds in Gaza that has to be destroyed completely. And I remind the Prime Minister's goal is to destroy Hamas, not just dismantle Hamas militarily. It has to be with no power in the near future in Gaza or in the long term. So that, I think, is the focus of what has to be in our eyes.
Vital, absolutely. General Rosen?
I think we're in a point of transition of power in many levels, both inside Lebanon, inside Gaza, as my two very good friends stated very well. Diplomacy has to gear in and take control and really take advantage of the military advantages that were gained in the last month and the last year. But transition of power and transition of control is a very, very tricky thing. It can, there's always the devil you know and the devil you don't know. And I hope that in this case, we will be smart enough, both in the case of the Gaza and the hostages, and Lebanon and the transition of power to someone else than Hezbollah that was holding power literally in Lebanon, and the region that is held in its throat by Iran. I hope this transition of power will be as successful as possible in the next few months.
Thank you, General Rosen, Dr. Barrahi, and Colonel Rayburn. Of course, we all pray for the safe return, first and foremost, of the 101 hostages. Many of them are not anymore amongst the living, but nonetheless, their families deserve to have their loved ones buried in a place where they can go and visit on a regular basis, and more so, the Iranian people deserve freedom. That is something that I fundamentally believe, and I know everybody who participated in today's panel also is convinced about that, whether vocally or behind the scenes. But nonetheless, I'd like to take this opportunity to thank all of you once more, wishing our Jewish viewers a Chag Sameach, as well as all of you at home, until our next update from here in Jerusalem. Shalom.
My name is Doron Gavish, and my background, 30 years of serving in the Israeli Air Force. My last job, I was the commander of the Israeli Air and Missile Defense during the introduction of the Iron Dome to the defense of Israel. All of this allows me really to be part of the team here in TV7. It is super important to have such a platform. We talk about the global situation, we talk about Israel, and those different angles which are relevant to the discussion.
For more of TV7's productions and editorials, we invite you to visit our website at www.tv7israelnews.com.